Military planners have been wargaming various scenarios, preparing for the worst, since the early days of the Cold War. Some of those plans are now out of date and have been partially or fully declassified. Citation needed. Operation Unthinkable. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was concerned that, with the enormous size of Soviet forces deployed in Europe at the end of World War II and the unreliability of the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, there was a serious threat to Western Europe. In April-May 1945, the British Armed Forces developed Operation Unthinkable, thought to be the first scenario of the Third World War. 13. Its primary goal was to impose upon Russia the will of the United States and the British Empire. 14. The plan was rejected by the British Chiefs of Staff Committee as militarily unfeasible. Operation Dropshot. Operation Dropshot was the 1950s United States contingency plan for a possible nuclear and conventional war with the Soviet Union in the Western European and Asian theaters. At the time, the U.S. nuclear arsenal was limited in size, based mostly in the United States, and depended on bombers for delivery. Dropshot included mission profiles that would have used 300 nuclear bombs and 29,000 high-explosive bombs on 200 targets in 100 cities and towns to wipe out 85% of the Soviet Union's industrial potential at a single stroke. Between 75 and 100 of the 300 nuclear weapons were targeted to destroy Soviet combat aircraft on the ground. The scenario was devised prior to the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles. It was also devised before U.S. President John F. Kennedy and his Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara changed the U.S. nuclear war plan from the city-killing counter-value strike plan to a counter-VS plan, targeted more of military forces. Nuclear weapons at this time were not accurate enough to hit a naval base without destroying the city adjacent to it, so the aim in using them was to destroy the enemy industrial capacity in an effort to cripple their war economy. Exercises Grand Slam, Longstep, and Mainbrace. In January 1950, the North Atlantic Council approved NATO military strategy at containment. 15. NATO military planning took on a renewed urgency following the outbreak of the Korean War in the early 1950s, prompting NATO to establish a force under a centralized command, adequate to deter aggression and to ensure the defense of Western Europe. Allied Command Europe was established under General of the Army Dwight D. Eisenhower, U.S. Army, on April 2, 1951. 1617 The Western Union Defense Organization had previously carried out Exercise Verity, a 1,949 multilateral exercise involving naval airstrikes and submarine attacks. Exercise Mainbrace brought together 200 ships and over 50,000 personnel to practice the defense of Denmark and Norway from Soviet attack in 1952. It was the first major NATO exercise. The exercise was jointly commanded by Supreme Allied Commander Atlantic Admiral Lindy D. McCormick, USN, and Supreme Allied Commander Europe General Matthew B. Ridgway, U.S. Army, during the autumn of 1952. The United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, France, Denmark, Norway, Portugal, Netherlands, and Belgium all participated. Exercises Grand Slam and Longstep were naval exercises held in the Mediterranean Sea during 1952 to practice dislodging an enemy occupying force and amphibious assault. It involved over 170 warships and 700 aircraft under the overall command of Admiral Robert B. Carney. The overall exercise commander, Admiral Carney, summarized the accomplishments of Exercise Grand Slam by stating, "We have demonstrated that the senior commanders of all four powers can successfully take charge of a mixed task force and handle it effectively as a working unit." Citation needed. The Soviet Union called the exercises warlike acts by NATO, with particular reference to the participation of Norway and Denmark, and prepared for its own military maneuvers in the Soviet zone. 1819 Exercise Striker Back. This was a major NATO naval exercise held in 1957, simulating a response to an all-out Soviet attack on NATO. The exercise involved over 200 warships, 650 aircraft, and 75,000 personnel from the United States Navy, the United Kingdom's Royal Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy, the French Navy, the Royal Netherlands Navy, and the Royal Norwegian Navy. As the largest peacetime naval operation up to that time, Exercise Striker Back was characterized by military analyst Hanson W. Baldwin of the New York Times as constituting the strongest striking fleet assembled since World War II. 20 Exercise Revolger. Exercise Revolger, from return of forces to Germany, was an annual exercise conducted during the Cold War by NATO. The exercise was intended to ensure that NATO had the ability to quickly deploy forces to West Germany in the event of a conflict with the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact outnumbered NATO throughout the Cold War in conventional forces, especially MRO. Therefore, in the event of a Soviet invasion, in order not to resort to tactical nuclear strikes, NATO forces holding the line against the Warsaw Pact armor spearhead would have to be quickly resupplied and replaced. Most of this support would have come across the Atlantic from North America. Revolta was not merely a show of force in the event of a conflict, it would be the actual plan to strengthen the NATO presence in Europe. In that instance, it would have been referred to as Operation Revolta. Important components in Revolta included the Military Airlift Command, the Military Sea Lift Command, and the Civil Reserve Air Fleet. 7 Days to the River Rhine 7 Days to the River Rhine was a top-secret military simulation exercise developed in 1979 by the Warsaw Pact. It started with the assumption that NATO would launch a nuclear attack on the Vistula River Valley in a first strike scenario, which would result in as many as 2 million Polish civilian casualties. 21 In response, a Soviet counter-strike would be carried out against West Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands and Denmark, with Warsaw Pact forces invading West Germany and aiming to stop at the River Rhine by the 7th day. Other routes plans stopped only upon reaching the French border on day 9. Individual Warsaw Pact states were assigned their own subpart of the strategic picture. In this case, the Polish forces were expected to go as far as Germany. The 7 Days to the Rhine plan envisioned that Poland and Germany would be largely destroyed by nuclear exchanges, and that large numbers of troops would die of radiation sickness. It was estimated that NATO would fire nuclear weapons behind the advancing Soviet lines to cut off their supply lines and thus blunt their advance. While this plan assumed that NATO would use nuclear weapons to push back any Warsaw Pact invasion, it did not include nuclear strikes on France or the United Kingdom. Newspapers speculated when this plan was declassified, that France and the UK were not to be hit in an effort to get them to withhold use of their own nuclear weapons. Exercise Able Archer Exercise Able Archer was an annual exercise by the U.S. European Command that practiced command and control procedures, with emphasis on the transition from solely conventional operations to chemical, nuclear, and conventional operations during a time of war. Able Archer 83 was a 5-day North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, command post exercise starting on November 7, 1983, that spanned Western Europe, centered on the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, SHAPE, headquarters in Kesto, north of the city of Mons. Able Archer exercises simulated a period of conflict escalation, culminating in a coordinated nuclear attack. 22 The realistic nature of the 1983 exercise, coupled with deteriorating relations between the United States and the Soviet Union and the anticipated arrival of strategic Pershing II nuclear missiles in Europe, led some members of the Soviet Politburo and military to believe that Able Archer 83 was a ruse of war, obscuring preparations for a genuine nuclear first strike. 22 23 24 25 In response, the Soviets readied their nuclear forces and placed their units in East Germany and Poland on alert. 26 27 This 1983 war scare is considered by many historians to be the closest the world had come to nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. 28 The threat of nuclear war ended with the conclusion of the exercise on November 11, however. 2930 Strategic Defense Initiative The Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, was proposed by U.S. President Ronald Reagan on March 23, 1983. 31 In the latter part of his presidency, numerous factors, which included watching the 1983 movie the day after and hearing through a Soviet defect that Able Archer 83 almost triggered a Russian first strike, had turned Ronald Reagan against the concept of winnable nuclear war, and he began to see nuclear weapons as more of a wild card than a strategic deterrent. Although he later believed in disarmament treaties slowly blunting the danger of nuclear weaponry by reducing their number and alert status, he also believed a technological solution might allow incoming weapons to be shot down, thus making the US invulnerable to a first strike. However, the US saw the SDI concept as a major threat, since a unilateral